Well, getting back to the core story,
Yes.
and because this is fundamentally not about Trump. This isn't about Russia. This is about the media. And Matt, you called Russiagate this generation's WMDs. What's your case for that?
Again, it's the mechanics of it were very, very similar. You have a person. So in the WMD episode, you had reporters who were being told a sensational thing. And the strength of the case for publication rested entirely on this idea that the person who you're getting the information from is credible, right? So the reporter doesn't actually get to confirm the information. What they're really doing is assessing the person who's giving them the information, right? And the underlying story turns out to be wrong, right? But people like Judith Miller and Michael Gordon, what they were, the trap that they got into was that they were assessing all these people who were coming to them with stories that sounded credible to them, right? Like there wasn't any reason for them not to believe it. And that's very similar to what happened with the Steele situation. The story kind of took off like a rocket because everybody was doing these stories about, not you, Michael, but lots of people were doing these stories about how Steele was the reincarnation of George Smiley. He was this super spy. He was this incredibly careful, well-connected figure. A lot, as Barry points out in his book, a lot of journalists thought that the information he was getting were coming from sources that from his MI6 days, which turned out not to be true. So there was this. It was this basically the same thing. You're reporting all these allegations, and you're basing that on the journey of these allegations and how credible the people who are telling them are.
Well, was it really about that credibility determination, or is that kind of a post hoc rationalization for some folks just wanting to do the story that was anti-Trump? Because I'm thinking about a much less significant leak, but one that was personally very irritating to me, which was the kind of leaked Biden call with civil rights leaders from last fall, where the media response was, I think April Ryan literally said, we shouldn't trust leaks that don't come from the White House. All leaks should be vetted by the White House, right? And it seems to me that if, that is clearly an instance where it's not about the credibility of who leaked it. We don't know who leaked it, but people will come up with whatever rationalization is required to believe or, dismiss the evidence presented according to their kind of ideological project.
I think that there's certainly some truth to the fact that, Trump was such an outlier and was, so outrageous on so many fronts that, it's a sort of fair game. He's fair game on every front. But I just want to sort of make a few more distinctions here and sort of reiterate my sort of bottom line point, which is, yes, the media coverage of the Steele dossier, especially on cable television, is not one of the glorious moments in American journalism. And many of the most aggressive promoters have failed to even address the fact that, they were promoting something that has turned out to be not true. But, I do want to, the New York Times is interesting in the way they've covered this because they continually make the point. They'll report on the Inspector General report that found all sorts of flaws in the Steele dossier and expose the fact that the collector, the main source for Christopher Steele, walked away from what Steele had written, describing it in many instances as just rumor and gossip. But I'm also sort of struck by the fact, this came up in my discussion with Barry Meyer, that the collector, this guy Danchenko, didn't even take any notes, nor did Steele. So it's sort of like, a game of telephone, and, it plops on the American political scene, and CNN and MSNBC goes crazy, and they keep reporting more and more of the Steele dossier is proving to be true, and I think there endless stream of stories to that effect, which are just wrong, right? I mean, today they are wrong, but that doesn't take away from the fact that there was something real going on, what the Russians were doing. That, this was an extraordinary intervention in American democracy by a foreign power and a foreign adversarial power. That was a big story. And Trump's, behavior, both during the campaign and during his presidency, culminating in that, bizarre Helsinki press conference, was pretty eyebrow raising and, legitimately fed questions about what the hell's going on here? Why is this guy so, kowtowing to Vladimir Putin at every opportunity he has? And, there were serious people in the U.S. intelligence and law enforcement community who believed that there must be something more to it than just Trump's general outrageousness about everything and anything. So I think we have to recognize that that's, a big part of the story, and it wasn't a hoax, and it wasn't a fraud, and, the media should be able to make distinctions between that which is real, the Russian intervention in the election, and Trump's, kowtowing to the Russians and sucking up to Vladimir Putin, and that which went beyond the reality, which was the Steele dossier.
Well, it's interesting. You're using these terms, kowtowing, or earlier when talking about the Trump campaign, willing to accept help.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you have the emails. Is that not a willingness to accept
what
that's Russia has to offer?
Sure, that's fine. I'm just saying it's interesting. You're saying this in 2021. I remember hearing about this shit for 3 years until the Mueller report came out. And said no collusion, and everyone said, "All right, well, we'll move on to something else," and that's it. And that this sucked up all of the oxygen in the room for 3 years.
Yeah, and by the way, I will say,
systemic issue in the media.
I will say, in defense of myself, since I'm the guest here, that I remember going on cable TV shows, in the run-up to the Mueller report, in which all the guests and the anchors were, the consistent theme is the walls are closing in on Donald Trump. Mueller's about to unload with, a mother load of indictments, the kraken of indictments. We didn't have that term until much later, but, that was the general gist of it. And I would look at the court filings by Mueller, and I would say, no, I don't see that. I actually don't see where he's got a serious criminal conspiracy case against the Trump campaign. And in that case, I was right. So, there were clues out there that, aspects of this were being overblown, but people were unwilling to want to accept them.
I mean, the issue of Russian interference and how serious that was, that exactly, whatever. That's a discussion for another time.
But that was the context for all. But it was the context for why we were.
But for the first 3 years of this story, the entire focus of the story was Trump's role in this interference and this conspiracy, this espionage conspiracy that he was said to be involved with. It was this unrelenting, like minute by minute, part of all of our lives. And, there was this constant drumbeat on cable news that was telling everybody in the country that this conspiracy was going to be exposed, that it was going to result in the premature end of Trump's presidency. And it all turned out to be wrong. It was all bullshit. And there's a reason. I mean, you can't just walk away afterwards and say, well, there were parts of it that weren't wrong. Like the way the public is looking at it, they see it as, a wholly politicized media that was just willing to believe the story without a whole lot of evidence because they liked what it said. And, how do you go for 3 years not asking all the questions that needed to be asked about this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I don't disagree with, I think we're in sync here that cable news in particular blew this up way beyond where it should have gone. I mean, I think that's indisputable, and it's still, astonishing to me that, folks say at CNN, will not sort of address that or accept
didn't this go further than cable news?
Well, I mean, I think that there were some stories that you look, especially on the idea of Trump having, is he agent of influence of the Russians and, other along those lines that went further than the facts were. I think that's fair, but I think it was cable that, I was trying to make the point before that the Times in its coverage of the flaws in the Steele dossier will repeatedly make the point, but the Steele dossier was only a small part, and the Carter Page FISA warrant was only a small part of the Mueller investigation, and it was much broader. And that's true as far as it goes. But as far as a sort of cultural phenomenon, the Steele dossier was much more important. And it did penetrate the culture. It did, influence the political dialogue in the country. And I think that's why, Barry Meyer's dissection of all that is a good contribution to media criticism.
But this is more than the Steele dossier. We could say, okay, maybe there's some dirty pool on the part of the Hillary Clinton campaign, but after Trump was inaugurated,
yeah,
it's like these stories are not coming from Clinton world anymore. Russia.
But there were real things. I mean, he fired Comey. I mean, he fired Comey because Comey wouldn't go along with what he wanted, to let Michael Flynn off and go. I mean, and was not going to be a cooperating camper to tube the Russia investigation.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm talking.
That's
especially
an
about the media.
alarming thing, right?
These stories being processed through. I mean, no one here is denying the gross criminality of Trump and his campaign and his associates and his presidency. Absolutely not. I'm saying that these are stories that were basically processed and fed to the public through the prism of there's a big scary Russia. And, they are constantly interfering with us. They've taken over our government. But, have no fear. Mueller is going to, he's going to get to the truth of the matter about the collusion. And this percolated down to, and Matt compiled a list of this. A number of stories in places like, and we're not talking MSNBC, CNN. We all know that's all bullshit. We're talking places like the Washington Post and New York Times reporting on things like, Russia, this energy company was hacked. It's, possibly Russia. And then, a quiet, which is a massive bombastic claim. And then a quiet, retraction a few days later. Oh, actually, we don't know what it was. Or you could see that story replicating in the, I would say the paranoia on social media about bot armies and propaganda and all that shit, which is all absolutely totally blown out of proportion into to what we know as the facts now. And my question is, would you concede that there was something of I would say a mass hysteria on the part of the establishment media, which did not like Trump, at all, and, possibly wishful thinking on the part of liberals in this hopefulness that,
right,
the indictments are going to come down and, he's getting impeached and he's getting out of there. And that was driving these errors in these stories, like these fictitious stories.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'd use the phrase mass hysteria, but, there's certainly, parts of the coverage was overblown. That's true. But, again, Trump did stuff that only seemed to validate, the suspicions that a lot of people had, right? I mean...
well, it wasn't just Trump, though. I'm looking at a New York Times article from February 21st. I think that was right before... South Carolina, right before Nevada. Russia is said to be interfering to aid Sanders in Democratic primaries. Do we all forget when Russiagate was applied to anybody who was inconvenient to the establishment narratives?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the stories that bothered me the most were the ones like the New York Times saying, the Trump campaign had repeated contacts with Russian intelligence, or they did a series of stories about George Papadopoulos being the catalyst for the FBI investigation of Trump. And then we find out years later in testimony by Andrew McCabe, who was the deputy director of the FBI, that in August of 2016, the FBI had already concluded that the evidence, quote, didn't particularly indicate that George Papadopoulos was communicating with the Russians, which means that the FBI sources were pushing reporters towards these stories for years, knowing that these were wrong stories, and reporters kept taking them over and over, hand over fist. They took them, and that's where I think the issue is that there was a lack of inquisitiveness about and anger once these stories started to fall apart. The press should have been a lot more angry about where they were coming from, especially when they were coming from the security services.
Yeah. I would just add a little, coda to all of this, which, I think shows the sort of ambiguity of the nature of a lot of this. So just a few weeks ago, the Biden administration's Treasury Department sanctions Konstantin Kilimnik, who was in aid to Manafort, and says that and asserts that Manafort shared sensitive polling data with Kilimnik, and that Kilimnik passed that along to Russian intelligence agencies. Now, that was it. What was the basis for that intelligence? We don't know. Is it new intelligence? It certainly goes further than what Mueller wrote in his report, or even what the Senate Intelligence Committee wrote in their report. So did new information come in, new intelligence came in that, supports that conclusion? Or are the Biden people manipulating intelligence for political effect? I don't know the answer to that, but it does strike me that after all the years of coverage of Russia that we went through, the lack of questioning to the Biden folks about this leaps out at me because, hell, if that happened, that is certainly a important data point in assessing what to make of what went on in 2016. But we don't know the answer, right? We don't know the answer. It may be it's true, by the way. It may be that it's true. I don't know. I think I can argue it both ways. There's pieces of evidence that would cut both ways on this. But I'm just saying that, it's puzzling to me, the lack of media focus on what was once a pretty big story.
Yeah, just quickly on that. Konstantin Kilimnik, he worked for the International Republican Institute for 10 years. He was, I lived in Moscow.
That doesn't mean he wasn't a Russian intelligence asset.
Not at all. But if he was a Russian intelligence asset, then the U.S. Embassy, the State Department, the IRI, and a lot of other agencies have a lot to answer for, in addition to the Trump campaign. If Kilimnik really is a Russian asset. How come no official has interviewed him? How come there hasn't been any of the investigators have reached out to him? He's barely been interviewed by the press. I mean, Aaron Monte was the first person to call him. It's similar to the Assange story. I mean, I was talking to somebody connected to WikiLeaks just before the Mueller report came out, and they just sort of blurted out to me that nobody from either the Mueller investigation or from the U.S. government has even tried to talk to us throughout any of this, which seems really odd. I mean, that's an odd detail. Like if Kalimnik is really the linchpin that we're hanging this whole thing on at this point, the lack of curiosity by a lot of people is really interesting to me. Like, why have the authorities not tried to talk to him? I mean,
he's in Russia, so I mean,
but he speaks fluent English. He's everybody. Yeah. I mean, I've got his number, and there's plenty.
I don't think if he was invited to come, for an FBI interview, he would likely accept. But
would he come on our show? Would he sit in the hot seat? I want to take this away from just the particulars of Russians. I don't know who they are, to more broadly about more pertinent issues in the media. And honestly, I'm more on Matt's. I mean, I agree with you, Michael. Yes, there are real things, underlying this narrative, but the way that those things were reported created a public narrative that was inscrutable, alienating, and as Bree points out, yes, it was not weaponized just against Trump. It was weaponized against the left. It was weaponized against anything that seemed to deviate from the overall establishment liberal consensus, whereby the word Russia became a watchword for, that's a scary, bad thing, that's nefarious, that's corrupt, and you could apply that to anything. It was a mass paranoia, and what bugs me is that we never got any kind of reckoning, any kind of mea culpa, like overall from the media. And because I think honestly a big reason why is because every single individual actor in this could be like, well, I didn't write that story, or well, I mean, I only retweeted that, or I might have fucked up a little bit, but we issued a correction, so everything's hunky dory. Which means that diffusion of responsibility meant that, it's still alive. People still talk about the Russia stuff. And I want to talk about this in the context of the 2020 election and exactly what the media has learned here and whether their standards have improved or gotten worse. And one part of that I find very interesting is the media treatment to the Hunter Biden story, right? Which I don't know if you saw this because it wasn't freaking reported anywhere except far-right media. And we have substantial evidence. Like this was real. Like this is the laptop, the all of this data, the photographs. Like this is all real. I've seen them, but you've got to go to the freaking deep web to see them. The media overall, they had in the run up last month of the election, October 2020, like they had an omerta about this story. Which putting aside the question of whether Hunter Biden himself is fair game, the consensus among the media was, well, it's not fair to report this because it might have come from Russia. It might have been sourced by a bad actor. And I want to ask, do either of you agree with that principle, which I see more and more today, that if something is sourced from a foreign government, the authenticity does not matter? That should just not be reported.
I mean, I think most reporters would tell you that it's usually not an issue. I mean, I think what we care about primarily is whether the thing is true or not. It's also legal in the United States to publish stolen material. There's a Supreme Court case on that. Obviously you do have to worry about the motives of the people giving you the information, and that was clearly a factor for a lot of people when, for instance, the emails about from the DNC and Podesta started coming out in 2016. I remember I was really careful just to do a couple of stories that I thought were about sort of legitimate corruption issues within the DNC, about campaign finance that had been enhanced by those emails. But you did have to worry about where was that coming from? But you can't just not cover it, I don't think.
Well, look, I mean, we had a discussion earlier about, if I had known that Christopher Steele was working for the Clinton campaign, would that have, would I have still written the story, or, would it have it certainly would have changed the way I viewed the story, but, would that have been the end of the story? No, because as you point out, the important thing is the information true? On the other hand, readers deserve to know where the information is coming from. In the Hunter Biden case, I agree that there should have been more aggressive coverage of the story. And I, like a number of other reporters, did try to pursue it. The problem was the key information was coming through Rudy Giuliani, who at this point was a highly suspect source about anything. And he wasn't making available, the laptops or images or other things that, we could use to verify what he's saying. As far as I can tell, it is likely that what's on that laptop, that laptop was indeed Hunter Biden's laptop. It did have some potentially quite interesting emails and material on it. I haven't seen anything that's, dispositive or a smoking gun in terms of implicating Biden himself in doing something wrong or improper.
Right. But that wouldn't be the standard for coverage. If one of Trump's kids had said something horrible, we all wax philosophical about the one who cut off the elephant's tail. I mean,
I agree that it should have gotten more coverage, and he is under criminal investigation by the Justice Department. And I'm, quite confident that if that results in criminal charges, it will be a big story in all of the media.
Yeah, I'm just curious because, caveats, but as we were talking a couple of hours ago, apparently there's this new batch of emails from Hunter Biden, or texts rather, that he exchanged with his lawyer, in which he uses the N-word to refer to his white lawyer and also makes some references to his genitals. And it's interesting that I would.
Where is this story coming from? I missed this one.
I'm seeing it. It's not good. It's not good papers. I see people tweeting it from the Daily Mail. I see the New York Post. The usual suspects. Yeah. But a part of this, and Matt, you've written about this. A part of it is, those are the institutions for political reasons that would publish something like this. And so then you get caught up in this feedback loop of, well, I'm not going to believe it because it's in this institution, it's in this rag. But the more credible papers aren't going to publish it, arguably for political reasons. So it never gets validated in that way. And it's the same argument that's made for people who go on Fox News who aren't invited on any of the liberal, in quotation marks, news channels, who then get this negative feedback loop of, oh, you must not be credible, you must be pro-Trump because you're going the only place that will have you.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Brie. The nature of the media landscape right now is that it's so divided, is that when one side screws up, typically they don't own up to it, and it's left to the people on the other side to do the corrections. So if you're a Fox watcher and Fox does something bad, then you're probably more likely to hear about it on MSNBC or, in a mainstream daily newspaper. And the reverse is also true. And that was true throughout Russiagate. There were all these developments that sort of exposed a lot of the parts of the Russiagate story, but you only saw them from reporters like Chuck Ross at the Daily Caller or from the Federalist or, in places like that. Or on Fox. And the issue there is that, you can't get somebody who's a Democrat to believe that material unless it comes out in a news source that they trust.
But Matt, we should make clear, though, those are nakedly partisan outlets.
Of course,
they're not interested in reporting anything other than promoting, their narrative, right? And
absolutely.
In this case, it was the pro-Trump. So that's a good reason to sort of, to be suspicious or at least, cautious about what they report. When the New York Times fucks up or the Washington Post fucks up or Yahoo News fucks up, at least people know that we strive for for something higher and better and
Michael,
and serious. Yes,
this is where I would
disagree, Brianna, but at least
because from the left perspective, Michael, I got to say, and this is what we ended up talking about. I think one or both of the times when I went on your podcast. From the left perspective, there is just as much skepticism for these liberal corporate outlets as there are for these conservative corporate outlets, which is why you see it's not that leftists are indifferent to Donald Trump or indifferent to Russiagate or indifferent to any of this, but we don't have quite the kind of a visceral, I can't believe they have it out to get us, they're so biased, fake news attitude, because we have seen that same infrastructure weaponized against the candidates and the brand of politics that we prefer, which is as equally or frankly more of a threat to the corporate status quo than someone like Donald Trump. So to wit, the headline I read out earlier, and the fact that they were trying to Russiagate Bernie right before a crucial primary when he was riding on the wings of a Nevada victory, a 3-state streak, I would argue, although some Buttigieg fans in the audience may contest. Hey YouTube, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and hit the notification button so you don't miss future uploads.
And subscribe to Bad Faith at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month. Get premium, subscriber-only episodes and support work like this.